Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Good afternoon and welcome to Point of View. I'm Debbie Georgatos, and I'm often here on Friday afternoons on the round table. Every once in a while, I have the great pleasure of getting to sit in for Kirby Anderson. Happy to be here today. Happy to be talking to you on Point of View. I want to start talking about something that a lot of you probably, or you may have watched last night on television. CNN held a town hall last night, and it was actually a discussion between Vermont Senator and former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, who's votes as a Democrat and identifies as a Democrat socialist, and then the other person was Senator Ted Cruz, the Texas senator who also ran for president last year. So the debate set up by CNN, or the discussion, a town hall, was about the upcoming budget discussion in Washington. And as you all likely know, there's going to be a big discussion in Washington about the budget. Now we have a Republican president and a Republican majority in the Senate and the House. So the bill is starting with them, with the Republican side. And there's, of course, a lot of discussion about priorities and spending in America. And in particular, there is discussion about who should be taxed, who pays taxes, and what kind of spending we should do as a country. One thing that was said last night, I wanted to be sure, because this is the kind of thing that is said by people on the left, in the media, in debates, in discussions, in speeches, and repeated over and over and over again until it becomes lore. It never becomes truth, because it isn't truth. But I want to talk with you about what was so incorrect, unfactual about what was said. And that was this. There is a data point that has been shared many times by people on the American left that essentially says the United States, our precious country, America, has the second highest rate of childhood poverty in the developed world. Only Romania is worse. It's saying, essentially, claiming that in our country, we in America, compare with other developed countries, that childhood poverty rate is very, very high. And, you know, I think most people would look at that and think, you know, gee, that doesn't sound right. I don't think that could be right. But, you know, as Christians, as people who love our fellow citizens, love our country, if there's any sense that our system is so profoundly unfair, especially to families with children, that we have children living in poverty, our hearts are going to go out to those people, and we're going to insist on change in our system of government to fix that problem. The problem is it is a completely fallacious, false statement, and I want to explain how the left arrives at that and how why they feel comfortable making that completely false point. And that is this: there is a United Nations organization called the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and they study all sorts of things related to poverty and distribution of wealth and how various countries are doing. So they, OECD, are the ones who have in several times ranked America very high in terms of having a childhood poverty rate. But it's how they get to the calculation that makes it a lie. What they do is they take in all these developed countries, and they claim they use this formula in order to have a sense of consistency, but they take the mean income, the median income. So they identify for every country, they take the percentage of people who earn less. So let's say the median income in some country, let's just for ease of numbers say, is $1 million a person, which it isn't, but just say that, $1 million. So what they do in the OECD, they take that number, the median income, meaning half the people make more and half make less than that. And then they divide that number in half, and they say the number of people living on less than half of the median income are designated in their formula to be living in poverty. So in America, with our wealthy country, our prosperous country, I know the million is not the right number. In fact, I think the number is something like 34,000 for America is the median income. So they're claiming that this what they claim as childhood poverty is every child living in a household earns less than half of that median. But folks, if you compare the prosperity of America with countless other countries around the world, our median income is so much higher than all these other countries that the lowest income earners in America, the poorest families in America, live better. In fact, there's another statistic that is never disputed, which is the bottom 10% of Americans live better than about 70% of the rest of the world. America is so prosperous that it's just factually inaccurate to try to claim that people falling under this OECD calculation, that this, families with children who have an income less than half the median income are considered impoverished. This is an absurd comparison because they're not looking at the absolute numbers. American children are thriving more than children in most other countries in the world. And the reason this matters so much is, in fact, the CNN Fareed Zakaria tried quoting this a few years ago and got called on it too because it was a lie. Got called on this, trying to claim that America's basically we're starving our children. But the left needs to perpetuate these misrepresentations about America, because if they admit how truly prosperous freedom is making America, they can't sell their big government ideas. Bernie Sanders wants big government control over society, over our country. He wants to have absolutely a single payer, or also known as socialized medicine system. So to sell this idea to America that you should surrender your freedom, surrender your healthcare freedom, surrender control of our society to the government, they have to convince you that as freedom is practiced in America, it's making America unfair. It's hurting children. And this is a lie. And I'm telling you this, folks, because Bernie Sanders knows how this number came about. He is not ignorant about it. He knows, he understands that this is a false number, intentionally is intended to get people worked up into a tizzy over the notion that America somehow is so, wealthy, and yet we are starving our children. Completely fallacious. America is, the children in America, the lowest income, are doing better than virtually every other, their parallel family members or children in countries around the world. America's not anything close to what the Democrats are trying to paint. The other thing that happened last night that was very, very important in this debate was there was a question. They permitted questions, and one came from Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute, an alleged think tank, international economics. In fact, the group is called the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And he posed a question, and he first argued that everything in Sweden and is really wonderful, and Denmark Democrat socialism is going great. But the other point he made, this is a guy, an advocate for big government liberalism. This guy said in the debate, Mr. Sanders, you seem to want, his quote was, I'm very sympathetic to what you're saying. My sense is you still would like to spend as a Scandinavian, but not tax as one. And he pointed out to Bernie Sanders and to the listeners that even the tax rates the Democrats agree they could be okay with, that they are targeting, isn't nearly enough to pay for the socialized medicine system they want to inflict on America. Senator Sanders wants socialized medicine, and he is not going to be about telling the American people what that really means for them, because once they figure it out, they're going to say, no, thank you. Okay, I'm Debbie Georgatos. I'm sitting in for Kirby Anderson on Point of View. So much fun. And we're going to a quick break. To call in today is 800-351-1212. Talk to you in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
News stories have been filled with statistics about police shootings. Although many of the statistics seem contradictory, they are remarkably consistent when you dig deeper. Let's start with facts that everyone can agree on. There is a statistical disparity. African Americans represent 13% of the American population, but 26% of the people killed by police are black. Many political candidates and even members of Black Lives Matter often stop with that statistic and don't consider a more relevant baseline. Heather McDonald, in her new book, The War on Cops, reminded my radio audience that according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, blacks were charged with 57% of murders and 45% of assaults. Another group we should consider are cop killers. These are men who present a lethal threat to police. According to FBI data, about 43% are black. In fact, law enforcement officers are killed by blacks at a rate at 2.5 times higher than the rate at which blacks are killed by police. Consider the study by Dr. Roland Fryer, Harvard professor of economics. As an African American, he said he was angry about the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and decided to collect data to understand what was happening in the streets of America. He and his research team examined 1,300 shootings. He found no evidence of racial bias when it came to lethal force. If anything, he found that blacks were slightly less likely to be killed. Roland Fryer admitted that this conclusion is the most surprising result of my career. For example, when looking at the issue of shoot or don't shoot, he found that officers in Houston were about 20% less likely to shoot suspects if the suspect was black. It is worth noting that he did find evidence of bias when it came to non-lethal force. You know, these latest statistics illustrate that many of the slogans used in protests simply are not true. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Based on the incredible true story and best-selling book from Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me, rated PG-13, in theaters October 20th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. This is Debbie Georgatos sitting in for Kirby Anderson and Point of View. So very, very happy to be here. I want to say a couple more things. And first of all, again, to call in, love to talk with you today. Our number is 800-351-1212. And we'll talk a little bit more about last night about this debate between Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Bernie Sanders, which was about the upcoming budget battle, because this is going to be ongoing, not just a discussion about how much control the federal government should have over the healthcare system, but just basically the size of government and how much of your life it should control. One thing that Bernie Sanders does, and actually it's going to tie in well to the story I want to get to in a minute relating to the military, but Bernie Sanders and the Democrats have really managed to normalize the concept of socialism in America. And I think that whatever it is, 20 years ago, certainly 50 years ago, most Americans knew that we are a free country. America and the Western world, we were called the free world. And it was to contrast ourselves with communism and socialism and the kind of the lack of freedom in those societies inherently. And part of being communist and socialist or socialist is a surrender of your freedom. And so Bernie Sanders has managed in the last election cycle and really for his entire political career to attempt to normalize socialism. One thing he does is constantly points to Denmark and other Scandinavian countries and essentially say, look, everything's so great over there. And in fact, he uses the word, it's like a utopia. So there's a book that is not new, but I want to point out some things just because every time you hear Bernie Sanders talk about Denmark, you got to remember these kind of things. The book is written by someone who lived in Denmark for many years. His book was called The Almost Nearly Perfect People, Behind the Myth of the Scandinavian Utopia. And what he basically talks about is that in Scandinavia, that first of all, there are surveys done all the time saying, how happy are you? And so these surveys are done around the world. Who's the happiest? And Denmark quite often comes out as the happiest. So people say, well, see, it's wonderful. They have free everything and it's socialist and everything's wonderful. A few things to put that into context. One is that some things are cultural. And within Sweden, as an example, he talked about culturally, it's very, very rude to say anything other than positive. Oh, great, wonderful, everything's swell. I mean, it is what people do in a just as a matter of politeness. But the reality, Denmark has a massive binge drinking problem. They are worse than any other country on the continent of Europe. Booze-related disease is the leading cause of death for Finnish men, and the second leading cause of death for women. The total bill for your taxes is somewhere between 58 and 72% of your income. They pay more than the Danish people pay more than anyone else. Books are so expensive; they're a luxury item. Just things like going to the store to get an aspirin or something, a minor thing. Pharmacies are a state-run monopoly, which means getting an aspirin is like a trip to the DMV. This is this guy's experience of living in Finland. And he also he has many examples to make the point, do not buy into this picture of Finland and socialism generally as being this utopia. And because right before I got on today, I had a friend call me and we were talking about these kind of stories, and he was making the point that, socialism, to be clear, is an economic system, and that is just basically the degree to which the federal government or the centralized government controls the economy and the industries and essentially takes away your freedom. That's socialism. Communism is just socialism, the economic system, with no way out, because only one party exists and you have to vote for them. So people try to say, well, that's socialism. It's nice and friendly, not like communism. You know what? The problem with governments trying to inflict socialism on their people is that people discover they don't like it and they fight for freedom. And then so the government becomes more and more determined and entrenched in its own growth of its own power and unwillingness to let the people challenge socialism. So anyway, I'm going to draw that distinction. I see we have a caller. I think I'll go ahead and take a call before I get on to my story about the military. And I can't see where it's from. Nevada. Hi. No, maybe we lost him. Okay. Well, we see if we can get Nevada to come back. And in the meantime, I wanted to switch over because we were talking about communism and socialism, and I want to hit this story. I do not know if Kirby Anderson's talked about it. I'm going to guess he would have over the last few weeks. But it's a really great question for patriots in America to ask themselves is, have we had so much legitimization of socialism through the Democrat Party, through the expansion of Obamacare, and so the kind of beginning tacit acceptance in America that I guess we're going to let the government run our healthcare system? Have we had enough of that in our country that we're not any longer able to say, socialism is basically un-American? Can we still say that? And then communism, which I just said a moment ago, communism is just socialism with no way out. Communism is a kissing cousin of socialism. These are not, ideologically opposite ideas. They're just, further steps down the track to the American left before you go over the cliff into misery. And so socialism and communism are very connected. So the story that I think probably Kirby talked about, but I want to mention today, it has to do with West Point and our military academies. And you probably know about this story, but briefly again, Second Lieutenant Spencer Rapone graduated from West Point. So he made it into the military academy. It's very competitive to get in there. All sorts of standards apply. But he made it in, and he went through West Point. At his graduation, he held up a picture of the inside of his cap, his graduation cap, which, was, I don't know if his graduation cap or just part of his uniform, but he had a message in there that says, "Communists will win." He also, underneath his military uniform, opened his uniform, the buttons on the top, to show that underneath he was wearing a T-shirt with Che Guevara on it. And so this is a guy who's finished West Point, who's actually served. He actually went to Afghanistan and served and came back. But this is a guy who has been, as it turns out, on Facebook, ardently striving and fighting for communism and believes in communism. And this is my question. I'm curious what our listeners think, and I'll always tell you what I think. But the concept that you have someone serving in the United States military who actually embraces communism should be should be grounds for immediate dismissal. It should be grounds for questioning whether he should have received the grades he received at West Point. Questioning, the notion, if we are not clear enough as a country that socialism and communism are simply inconsistent with the liberty on which America is based, if we can't say that, then I think we're really in trouble. And this is the problem in part when you have a Bernie Sanders and other people in the American left pushing the Democrat Party, pushing America away from liberty, away from the kind of basic formulation of our country's identity, which is based on the liberty of the individual, pushing us toward government-controlled society, pushing us toward socialism. I don't know if we've lost our way. I don't know if we've lost our ability to say in America that, that just doesn't belong in our military. We have free speech. He can say what he wants, but he can't say it in the military. And West Point is still looking into this. They've issued several statements about it. They're looking into the grades he got, the courses he got, whether his conduct violates anything. I think his conduct is inconsistent with his oath to uphold the Constitution. You can't have liberty and the kind of system of government that we create in our Constitution and be a communist, or you just can't do it. You've got to choose between them. And I think in America, it's a great conversation to have, a reinvigoration of the American identity. So I think we have this caller on the line. I'm not sure. We have a caller on line 1, I do believe. No, okay, we don't have him. Well, you know what? Then I want to say a couple more things then about this case, because this is an opportunity for the military academies, for Americans themselves to speak up about the idea of whether they think that, whether we can agree with ourselves still in this 2017 with all that's happened in our country. Can we agree with ourselves still that do we understand that socialism and communism are simply inconsistent with the idea of America, with the idea of a country founded on the liberty of the individual, inconsistent with free markets, which flow necessarily from the notion of the freedom and liberty of the individual. And I hope we can, but I think it's actually a very healthy conversation. I wish we would have more open conversation by our elected officials about this case, that we can't get so confused by our values that we say, well, we honor free speech, and you certainly have political freedom in America, and an individual can express support for socialism and communism, and there is a communist party in America, and it's not illegal, and you can join it. I mean, there's a First Amendment right to hold your ideas and believe in your values, but is there really do we have the wisdom and clarity as a country to say it's one thing to let people believe in a lot of crazy stuff. You can be an anarchist, you can be a communist, but to serve in our military and to uphold your oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, you simply cannot be an advocate for communism. You can't. It's inconsistent with your place in America. So we're going to go off to break in a minute, but I want to tell you we have a really, really, really cool guest coming up in the next segment. My husband and I had a chance to meet him recently in a conference in Colorado Springs. His name is Dr. Everett Piper. He wrote the book, Not a Daycare, The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. And he's talking about all the stories we've all been hearing about in college campuses, the notion that we have just coddled our younger generation and they can no longer handle the concept of discussing truth. So we're speaking with Dr. Everett Piper. He's the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University, author, and really smart guy. Don't go away.
Sometimes I joke that I'll win the lottery when God blows the winning ticket across a parking lot to me. I don't buy tickets, so if he wants me to win, that's the way. Pretty silly, right? But a lot of us take a similar stance when it comes to the ills of our culture. We don't do anything. We simply hope things will change. I encourage you to get in the game and make things change. Join Truth Team 360 and be part of a work that changes lives and communities. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
From Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me. Ron and Debbie Hall have everything they could ever want, except for a loving marriage. But when Debbie befriends a homeless man, their lives begin to intersect, and they are all changed forever.
Amazing how far a little tender loving care can go.
Same Kind of Different as Me, based on the true story, in theaters October 20th, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. More information is available at samekindofdifferentasmemovie.com.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station.
And
now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. I'm Debbie Georgatos, very happily sitting in for Kirby Anderson and enjoying hosting Point of View. And as I mentioned before our break, we have online this hour an author, Dr. Everett Piper. And as I mentioned, my husband and I had the great pleasure of meeting him recently at a conference. And his book is called Not a Daycare, The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. And he's the president of Oklahoma Wesleyan University. So hello, Dr. Piper.
Well, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm honored.
It's great to have you on, and I think your book is fabulous. And I was actually skimming through. I was on a flight last night, coming home from another event, and I was skimming through and starting to stick stickers on the pages and realized it was just a sea of stickers, and you can't do that. Then you're totally distracted. So now I have a list of questions, but I'd love to have you start again, if you would, and tell us just that this book is, it was an article I mentioned to you when Eric and I met you in Colorado, that I had, when your column first came out about Not a Daycare, I actually read it out loud on my radio show because I loved it. But tell our listeners, if you would, the kind of springboard event that happened at Oklahoma Wesleyan that caused you to write your famous Not a Daycare memo.
Sure. It was about 2 years ago this Thanksgiving. We have required chapel at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. We're boldly and unapologetically Christian. We're conservative. We don't apologize for that. We tell students that there's no student that comes to my institution not understanding that we stand for the primacy of Christ, the priority of Scripture, the pursuit of truth, and the practice of wisdom. But in spite of that, during a chapel service at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, we had a student come forward afterward and confront the speaker. And he basically said this: "You offended me, you singled me out, you made me feel uncomfortable, and you made my peers feel uncomfortable." The speaker contacted me and said, "Hey, I need to give you a heads up. I had a student come forward today and basically play the victimization card." And I said, "Well, what in the world was your speech on, your sermon on?" And I said, "Send me a copy of the text. I want to read what you said." So he did, and lo and behold, the sermon topic was 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, the quintessential love chapter of the Bible. Love is patient, love is kind. And this kid felt offended by it. I was incredulous. I wrote my weekly op-ed in the local newspaper, and I basically said this: you know, that feeling of discomfort you had when you heard that sermon on love, it's called your conscience, and you might want to attend to it. And if you expect us to coddle you and make you feel comfortable rather than confront you and challenge your character, you're in the wrong place. And I said, we're not going to issue trigger warnings before altar calls. We actually are going to teach you what is right and just and real and true, and we expect you to grow up here. Then I concluded by saying, my land, this is a university. It's not a daycare. The thing went viral. 3.5 million people read it in a couple weeks. Thus, I'm talking to you on this radio show today.
I love having you on Point of View, and I'll mention for our listeners, since I have the microphone, that in just a few weeks, Dr. Everett Piper will join me on my radio show, which is called America Can We Talk, and we are going to talk about this same book too, because we in my radio show, I've started doing these things called snowflake updates, and we just kind of run through stories, not every week, but frequently, about things that happen on college campuses, and you do shake your head about them. But what I loved about your book so much is you dove in below just the recounting of these crazy things that happen on college campuses and try to get at the roots of the problem that are causing students to have, like this young man you're describing, who got upset about that beautiful scriptural passage that most of us had read at our weddings. Just amazing. So I wanted, so on your book, this is Not a Daycare book. You talked a lot about the changes over time in American institutions, American colleges, to where we've shifted away from a search for truth and to a more of a notion that college is there to coddle and to make you feel good about yourself and embrace identity politics in terms of your race or skin color, just all the things that are so popular on campus, but it has driven people away from the concept of education as a desire to pursue truth. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, our culture has abandoned truth with a capital T. How many times have you heard your kids or your grandkids or your niece or your nephew say, whatever, it doesn't matter what you believe as long as it works for you? And they've been drinking this cultural Kool-Aid of what I would call moral nihilism and intellectual nihilism, that it doesn't matter. There's nothing out there that's right or real or just or true. It's all a matter of opinions. And if you feel a given way, the facts don't matter. If your opinion causes you to conclude this, then there are no truths that can trump your opinion. It's the culture in which we live. And even people listening to the show right now that don't have kids in college, you should care very much about what we're talking about right now, because what's taught today in the classroom will be practiced tomorrow in your church and in your culture and in your corporation and in your living room. Richard Weaver wrote a book in 1948. He titled it Ideas Have Consequences. And what was his point? ideas have consequences. There's no such thing as a neutral idea. All ideas will bear fruit. Good ideas, good culture, good church, good community, good kids, and bad ideas, the opposite. And what we see right now in our college classroom and in our courtrooms and in our culture and in our corporations, and I would argue even in our churches, is the consequence of teaching self-absorption and narcissism for decades. And now we're surprised that we see self-absorbed and narcissistic students in our culture and in our classes and prancing and preening in these protests in the campus green.
Absolutely. You know, I'll tell our listeners in the next hour, the second hour today, we're going to have on a guest, Katherine Kersten, who wrote a brilliant thing that is describing the Edina, Minnesota schools right outside of Minneapolis. So this is kind of the lower, I don't know, Dr. Piper, if you're familiar with her, but she's talking about what's happening in Edina, Minnesota by the same kind of corruption of the goal of education to teach in this previously very stellar public school district. But these are kids go through Edina school district taught that the entire purpose of life is to punish white supremacy and exalt our physical appearances. And then they get to college and they get more of that. And then we end up with a culture where we are. So anyway, so stay tuned for Katherine Kersten's second hour. But Dr. Piper, in your book, you talk a lot about the idea that, that the original concept of universities, there was a universally recognized notion, at least in Western civilization, that it was premised on a pursuit of truth and a foundational assumption that God exists and truth exists, and we are here to learn about that truth. How do we get away from that?
Well, and you're spot on. I cite Oxford. I say if you want to go back 1,000 years, let's say, to the birth of the liberal arts academy, of the liberal arts philosophy, let's go back to Oxford and claim that as the birthplace, the cradle of the liberal arts. Well, what was the point? The word liberal meant liberate. It was an education for a free man and a free woman, a free culture, a free society. It was an education in liberty and justice and righteousness. In veritas, the word that is still on Oxford's shield to this day, Latin for truth. Veritas. It was the pursuit of truth. It was honoring the words of Jesus. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. We've stepped away from that. We've abandoned truth. We now worship opinions and feelings rather than facts and truth, and therefore we find ourselves subject to power and politics and popularity and the pundit at the podium, if you will, as opposed to being able to celebrate the freedom that we can only have in Christ, the freedom that we can only have within fences, as G.K. Chesterton tells us. I would conclude by saying this on this last question. Chesterton said when you get rid of big laws, you don't get liberty, but rather thousands of little laws that rush in to fill the vacuum. And what we've done in the academy is we've gotten rid of the big laws. We can't live by 10 any longer, and Jesus said there were only 2. So what do we have? Thousands and thousands and thousands of little laws being imposed by everybody, whether it be the pupil in the classroom or the professor or the pundit or the politician. Whoever has power, whoever has the megaphone, will impose his laws, his regulation on all of society. And what's the result? We lose our freedom. We become subject to fascism as opposed to having the academic freedom and intellectual liberty that the Liberal Arts Academy was supposed to give us.
I love that whole answer. Thank you very, very much. We're going to, we have a break coming up here in just a minute, and I want to talk when we come back from the break. You use expression cultural Marxism, and I want to talk about that because that concept gets mocked. Certainly, well, many conservative Christian concepts get mocked, but that particular one of kind of replacing truth and our identity as God's children with a sense of cultural Marxism as our identity has really been very detrimental to our culture, to our ability to have conversations, to understand each other. So in just this other minute we have before we head off to our break, I do want to talk about, ask you quickly, don't parents have a role in all of this, both raising their children and also in getting back to the college campuses and pressuring them to make changes? And don't parents have some role?
Spot on. I know the time is quick here, so I'll just say this. Yes, stop sending your kids off to these institutions that teach this pablum. Vote with your wallet. Vote with your pocketbook. Why would you want to drop $20, $30, $40, $50,000 on the barrelhead to send your kid off to an institution that's going to rip his heart, mind, and soul out? 70% of our kids lose their faith before they become juniors in college, but yet we keep sending them to these places. We need to do our research.
Absolutely. Folks, if you're listening and loving this, we're talking to Dr. Everett Piper. The phone-in number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back as fast as we can and talk more with Dr. Everett Piper.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The United States military probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Jewish High Holy Days. Yet thanks to our country's dedication to religious liberty, our military has often shown its respect for the faith of its service members. Back in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, about 5,000 Jews served in our country's military. 4,000 of them put in for furloughs in order to attend services for the Jewish high holidays. By 1944, the Nazis had exterminated almost every Jew in the French village of Verdun. A year later, 500 Jewish American GIs would gather in Verdun's town square to observe Rosh Hashanah. That same September, on the other side of the globe, B-29 crews occupied the island of Guam. For many of them, it would be their last Rosh Hashanah. The hangar was converted to a Jewish house of worship under the direction of the commanding general for that station, himself not Jewish. Still, men of all faiths built seats, a pulpit, the Holy Ark for Scriptures, erected lighting, and even a sound system. 1,500 men would pray for, quote, peace to him who is far off and to him that is near. These are just a handful of ways in which the United States military, even during times of war, acknowledge the essence of the First Amendment, that men have a great duty to the Creator, that government must respect. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Debbie Georgatos, sitting in for Kirby Anderson, having a blast, talking with Dr. Everett Piper, the author of Not a Daycare. And, you know, there's a term you use in the book, and then I want to turn and talk to you about some modern examples, in fact, things in the news today at college campuses. But you use the expression cultural Marxism, and I love it, and I have a definition myself, but I want to understand what you use that term to mean.
Well, I would suggest this, that if you're a Marxist, you're also a radical Darwinist. And if you're a radical Darwinist, you're probably prone to be a Marxist. Marxism assumes that the human being, the definition of the human being is that you rise up out of the primordial ooze and that you're going to be the product of your environment, the product of stimuli, that you're the imago dog, if you will, rather than the imago Dei. I would argue that that's antithetical to the biblical model and the biblical definition of what it means to be a human being. Let me go back to imago dog, imago Dei. Imago Dei means we're made in the image of God, and we have moral responsibility and culpability and moral understanding therein, that we're not animals, that we're human beings, and that we behave differently. If you're the imago dog and you're made in the image of an animal, you're going to be subject to your appetite and to stimuli, and you're going to be defined by your gut, your belly, and your instincts and your inclinations. Radical Marxism assumes that the human being is nothing more than the animal and develops these economic systems and these social constructs and these laws and regulations to control the beast. It doesn't elevate the definition of what it means to be human. It diminishes you to the lowest definition and actually insults the human being by suggesting you're nothing but the sum total of what you're inclined to do.
That's a great definition. And, you know, that is an expression which you can tell it gets to the American left when people use that expression, cultural Marxism, because it's mocked all the time. And you know, on the in liberal America, mocked as just a complaint by people who can't get with the modern world, can't deal with modern reality, so they mock it. But I want to ask you, a couple of things happened in this. Again, the story I think just came out today from Evergreen State College, and for our listeners, I'm sure you follow. They've had quite an episode there with students protest and the Black Lives Matter protest. And I don't mean to put you in the spot, Dr. Piper, if you didn't see this story, but this group called the College Fix actually uncovered documents recently that we wrote about today, talking about the length to which the school tried to suppress all criticism of Black Lives Matter. And just one example, they had pictures, some group put out pictures on campus that showed a black police officer with a gun in his hand and a black criminal-looking type with a gun in his hand, and had at the bottom, whose life matters, making the obvious political point that, you have black police officers who put their lives on the line to defend America. And so just it was a poke at the Black Lives Matter movement. And the school viewed the school, and get the name of this group, the Bias Response Team at Evergreen State, quickly gathered up all of these, launched an investigation into who had possibly put out this onerous and obnoxious flyer, and ended up with it's barely English, is what I often refer to as like blather speak from the American left. It doesn't make any sense. Yeah. But basically said it's a biased message. It's therefore unacceptable. Anything that undermines or questions the legitimacy of a social movement advocating for social justice for black people conveys bias against people of color. So that speech wasn't allowed. So we're so far gone on some of these secular campuses. But I have 10 stories in front of me, but I want to ask you, how do we get back? Assume you're not a Christian university, but you're still a university where you want your children to learn truth. How can we get this back under control?
Oh, there's so much wrong with that story that you shared with me. I could go on and on and on. First of all, I don't talk about social justice at Oklahoma Wesleyan University. I talk about biblical justice. Justice is defined by Scripture, by revelation, by immutable truths. It isn't defined by society or constructs or you or me. The social justice movement in and of itself is problematic because it dumbs down justice to nothing but what society decides it's going to be on a given time and a given day and a given place. And you see that at Evergreen State right now. And then the ideological fascism versus academic freedom. These people are fascists. They're suppressing freedom of speech and academic freedom. They're crushing it. They're saying if you dissent, if you don't agree with us, if you don't believe like we believe and think like we think, you're verboten, you're unwelcome, you must leave. How in the world could they claim to believe in academic liberty and intellectual freedom and claim this Orwellian doublespeak of having a biased response team? It is just nonsense, and we need to answer your question. How do we address this thing? Rhetorical questions like Christ would ask. Do you believe in freedom? Ask them if they believe in freedom. Do you believe in tolerance? They will hold tolerance as the highest virtue. Well, then ask this question. Can you tolerate my intolerance? Do you hate hateful people? Are you sure that nothing is sure? I mean, it's just nonsense. Ask the question, expose the lunacy of their worldview, and then watch them drop their stones and walk away.
Dr. Piper, do you hear from other administrators, I'm sure at Christian colleges you do, but from colleges around the country, Christian or not, do you hear from other administrators saying, essentially, thank goodness you wrote this book, thank you for speaking up?
Unfortunately, very few. And I'm critical in the book of my industry. We've created this monster. It's turning around to consume us, and most of the leadership in the academy doesn't have a clue what to do. They have no spine, they have no courage, and they're just doing what Evergreen State is doing. They're creating bias response teams, and they're feeding the monster rather than trying to control it or perhaps even kill it, because it's not good for freedom. Therefore, you don't continue to feed the beast. But no, most of my peers are afraid to speak up, or they actually agree with this nonsense, and they're perpetuating it.
Well, that was my next question is, among all these college administrators and professors, I have had the sense in some of these stories that the aggressiveness of the left or the politically correct view, it makes it so hard for students to speak up who are conservative and Christian, but it makes it hard for faculty too. And I often wonder out there in academia, do you really have a tiny mob running the schools and the rest of the professors or a vast majority of them, the administrators, kind of sitting back and silenced because they don't want to be mocked? I mean, do you have any idea if there's just more anger toward this takeover of our universities than we hear about?
Oh, unfortunately, I'm going to give you bad news on this. 97% of the faculty and administration of our colleges and universities are radical left. 97%. You might have 3, 4, 5% in given places of conservatives. Most of them are afraid to speak up and raise their hand. They're just trying to make it through and get tenure and protect their careers. But even if those 5% did speak up more aggressively, there's still only 5%. It's still only 3%, whatever that number may be. But you've got 95, 97% that are left of center, and proudly so.
Wow, you make it. I'm sorry to hear that 97% number. That's terrible. So one last thing, just because we're talking about college campuses, and we're going to talk in the second hour with someone who's looking at the local schools and the public schools in Edina, Minnesota, elementary, junior, and high school. But I see a big connection between the culture we've, and I'm sure you do too, but the culture we've created in these universities where we exalt race to the movement for right now. For example, we are trying to take down these symbols of the Civil War, take down Robert E. Lee statues, remove any names of any institutions that carry the names of Civil War characters. And it's a very dangerous thing because it's a crushing of our history and, or in my view, a rejection of Western civilization's values. And we only have a minute left, but do you see that connection between what's happening in campuses and what's happening in our culture?
Absolutely. Let me say this. When you tear down statues, you're going to then start tearing down statutes with 2 T's. Yeah. The statue is a symbol of a statute. And if you're going to besmirch and tear down the statue, the next thing in your sights is to tear down the statutes, the laws, the principles, those things that serve as the foundation for a culture. Yes, they're connected. And it all goes back to teaching terrible ideas in the academy.
It sure does. One other case I can't even get to today, but there's a college that had a continue amazingly to have a requirement to teach for kids to take Western civilization, and they're now the recipients of a protest about you can't make us learn these ugly ideas. Okay, Dr. Piper, thanks for a great book, Not a Daycare. Thank you for coming on today. So I appreciate talking with you.
Oh, I'm blessed. Thank you.
And folks, after the break, we're going to talk a little more about education and look for your calls at 1-800-351-1212. Come right back.
From director Kevin Sorbo and executive producer Sean Hannity comes Let There Be Light. Saul Harkins is a man who has turned away from God, but a near-fatal car crash gives him one last chance to renew his life, his family, and his faith. Let There Be Light, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters October 27. More information is available at LetThereBeLightMovie.com.
Christianity is based in history, on evidence, and all truth revealed in God's Word is for our good, not just spiritually, but in every way. Point of View's mission is to restore God's truth in our culture, and to do it effectively, we need you as a partner. Your gift helps inspire people, young and old, from coast to coast to rebuild truth in their communities. Join the Truth Team today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Get off the sidelines. Pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Hello, and so glad you've tuned in. I'm Debbie Georgatos. I'm so happy to be sitting in for Kirby Anderson on Point of View. I'm going to go ahead and just jump to calls right now because we have another guest coming on with us in the next segment. So let's start, if we could, with Pamela from New Hampshire. I think we have her. No, we don't have her. Okay, you know what? I'm not as good at the system as other people. I think we had Pamela from New Hampshire, and maybe we should just try Rich from Texas. Is he available on the line? No, we don't have him. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and talk, and maybe we'll figure out what's going on there. But in the meantime, I was going to mention a couple other stories. I guess I'm on an education theme today. It's kind of funny. Every time I do my own show, which is called America Can We Talk. In fact, I'll make a quick plug for it. America Can We Talk is actually on Salem radio station. It's on, first of all, anywhere where you are, you can listen to my show. It is on Facebook Live. I do it live on Facebook. It's Sunday evening, 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. And on the Facebook page for my show, it's just America Can We Talk, 6 to 8 p.m. Sundays. We do it on Facebook. You can also go to americacanwetalk.org, click on Listen Live. You can listen that way. Or you can tune in. We're here in Dallas, Texas on 660 a.m. And then the show is also now very happily on in Phoenix, Arizona on 960 The Patriot. And it's starting in 2 more weeks. And we'll be joining the joining the station in Colorado Springs. So we're growing and love to have you tune in. We pretty much talk about America. But so I get ready for the shows, and it just really occurred to me, education seems to be falling into a place as a good theme. I want to just tell one other story and then tell you something about Betsy DeVos, who was appointed by President Trump and is our Secretary of Education. But this is just an example of why you should care about these college stories. We talked with Dr. Everett Piper. Obviously, his book is full of examples of stories. And honestly, you read these and you can think, these are so absurd. You almost feel like you're reading fiction. Like you think this couldn't really happen. It could not be as egregious or as prevalent as it appears to be in the media. But the truth is, it is. It's just simply amazing. One story I want to share with you today is out of Reed College in Portland, which, they happily, at least they honestly admit they're very left-leaning. But Reed College, so some young man started out, he wanted to go there for his freshman year, so off he goes, named Hunter Dillman. And he is a student at Reed, and he was walking to dinner with a friend on college campus this year, saw a Facebook post from the leader of a Latina group who wrote that her group planned to, in quotes, stop Trump. And so she was asking fellow students for support in a school funding survey. So they trying to get school funds to support her Latina group to stop Trump. So this young man, Hunter Dillman, was curious about it, considered getting involved. He asked her a couple of questions, asked her a couple of times, I guess through Facebook, to be more specific about how the group planned to stop Trump. Good question. Some ways legal, some not. So he's asking how he planned to do that. Because he asked her several times and she didn't answer him, I guess she didn't like that. So she accused him of being a racist for challenging a Latina student, a Latina student support group. And then he responded by saying to her, if the group called people racist just for asking questions, he had no intention of voting to fund it. So a few minutes later, this Latina activist happened to meet him waiting in line at the dining hall. And she continued her accusations, calling him a little white boy. And he was so mortified and embarrassed, so he took off, went back, took his food back to his room, ate in his dorm, and was watching Facebook as she is starting a storm of assault, verbal assaults on him, denouncing him as a bigot. Him and other, he was being denounced by this young woman, this Latina student, and many other people. And the next day, walking across campus, students were screaming racist at him. This is for asking a question of a group. What is it you mean by stop Donald Trump? What are you going to do? So this young woman ended up driving this kid off campus. He dropped, and in fact, he went to the Reed's administration, which took the side of the mob against the student. So the student dropped out. He's now actually working in construction. He's not even in college. And I tell you that story to say these stories, they're not, they can seem, as I say, so crazy. You can't believe they're happening in America. But they're happening, and they are beyond ridiculous. And yet we are, as a culture, we're kind of catching up to it and saying, gee, these are really bad. What should we do? And so Dr. Everett Piper's book talks a bit about what people can do. Parents at these schools, alumni of these schools, need to be pressuring the universities to get off their, wacky left-wing mode and return to the earnest, goal of what should be for all colleges and universities, which is the pursuit of truth. Even leaving aside if you're not a Christian university, you're just a secular university, the notion of actual tolerance for viewpoints not your own, to be able to listen and have respectful exchange of ideas. The pressure has to come on the universities monetarily, or they won't change, because they are filled, as you just heard from Dr. Piper, filled with left-wingers, 97% of them in the faculty in this country and universities, radical leftists, and they aren't going to listen to anything except if the school has to close down, they lose their job. Got to be monetary pressure. Okay, I think we're going to take one more shot here to call. I think we have Rich in Texas. Is he available? Is he online? What? Okay, I guess not. Okay, we're going back and forth signaling here. Okay, you know what? I'm gonna want a quick turn and tell you one last story, and I'm very sorry, Rich. If you can hear me, I'd love to talk with you. We're somehow not. I'm probably supposed to be clicking on something. I'm not. I want to just tell you one last thing that was a good thing on the subject of college campuses in America. In the last couple of minutes in this segment, and then we have a guest coming up, another great guest. But the story I want to share with you involves the person that the president nominated as Secretary of Education, and she's in that job, Betsy DeVos. And one thing she did, which was a great, great, great step, was she said, we're going to get rid of this Obama era, and it wasn't even a rule or regulation passed by an agency. It was just simply a letter of understanding, memorandum of understanding, I forget what he called it. But the point was, he began insisting at college campuses to comply with Title IX, the non-discrimination law, begin have in place on these campuses a venue for an ability for young students, women, mainly women, to complain about sexual harassment on campus. And the way that these programs were set up under this direction from the president, they essentially presumed the guilt of the young man accused of sexual assault. No due process protections were afforded to him at all. And there are stories after story after story of young men driven out of college campuses because of the system set up under this Title IX regulation. And so what the great thing Betsy DeVos has done is she said, we're done with that. We're not going to deprive young college students of due process, deprive them of the ability to defend themselves, to cross-examine witnesses, to be represented, because the consequence of being thrown out of college for allegedly committing sexual harassment are monumental. It is way worse than having a fired from a job on your resume to deal with. And so this Betsy DeVos did a great thing on college campuses, beginning to reverse the politically correct, ridiculous, really assault on the rights of individual young men on college campuses. And even, this is one time in my life, I agree with the California Governor, Jerry Brown. He even said, can't do this here. Okay, folks, I'll zip off to a break. When we come back from our break, we have Kathy Kersten from Minnesota to talk about the Edina Public Schools. Don't go away.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
News stories have been filled with statistics about police shootings. Although many of the statistics seem contradictory, they are remarkably consistent when you dig deeper. Let's start with facts that everyone can agree on. There is a statistical disparity. African Americans represent 13% of the American population, but 26% of the people killed by police are black. Many political candidates and even members of Black Lives Matter often stop with that statistic and don't consider a more relevant baseline. Heather McDonald, in her new book, The War on Cops, reminded my radio audience that according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, blacks were charged with 57% of murders and 45% of assaults. Another group we should consider are cop killers. These are men who present a lethal threat to police. According to FBI data, about 43% are black. In fact, law enforcement officers are killed by blacks at a rate at 2.5 times higher than the rate at which blacks are killed by police. Consider the study by Dr. Roland Fryer, Harvard professor of economics. As an African American, he said he was angry about the deaths of Michael Brown and Freddie Gray and decided to collect data to understand what was happening in the streets of America. He and his research team examined 1,300 shootings. He found no evidence of racial bias when it came to lethal force. If anything, he found that blacks were slightly less likely to be killed. Roland Fryer admitted that this conclusion is the most surprising result of my career. For example, when looking at the issue of shoot or don't shoot, he found that officers in Houston were about 20% less likely to shoot suspects if the suspect was black. It is worth noting that he did find evidence of bias when it came to non-lethal force. You know, these latest statistics illustrate that many of the slogans used in protests simply are not true. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Based on the incredible true story and best-selling book from Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me, rated PG-13, in theaters October 20th.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. This is Debbie Georgatos. I'm sitting in for Kirby Anderson. How much fun is this? And we have on the line a guest in this hour. I mentioned in the first hour, we're going to be talking with Katherine Kersten, and she's both a writer and an attorney, but she's also the Senior Policy Fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. And I think I've mentioned her in the show before, or this organization, Center for the American Experiment, is a conservative public policy group in Minnesota, similar to one we have here in Texas and every state across the country. And they just look at policy solutions that keep that hold on to liberty. And so Kathy, first of all, welcome. Hello.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Okay. So this article, there's a lengthy article that Kathy wrote, and this we want to talk about today, but kind of connected to our conversation the first hour with Dr. Everett Piper, who wrote Not a Daycare, talking about the need for college campuses to, to drop the focus on racial identity and to refocus on teaching the pursuit of truth and vigorous academic discussion and all that. Kathy Kersten, who's on the line with us today, has written something called an article, a very lengthy article called Whose Values Educational Excellence Threatened by Ideology in the Edina Schools. This is Edina, Minnesota, which I was up in Minnesota this summer. I love Minnesota. Anyway, so she wrote this article about what has happened to the Edina schools, which were top-notch and now have been suffering a great decline in performance on a variety of measures. So I'm just going to let you start. But tell us what you were getting at, or what you were writing about in this article.
Well, I think this is so important for people around the country to understand, because this is coming to public schools almost everywhere. And what's happened is that the Edina schools for decades made academic excellence for all the watchword, the goal. And in the last few years, this priority has been driven out by a social and political agenda, an ideological agenda, which seeks to do two things. First of all, essentially to get kids to view the world through the lens of race, class, and gender, and then to carry on and to become political activists looking at the world through this lens.
Well, those are already really bad things. You know, in the article that you wrote, and I urge, in fact, by the way, everything we're talking about, including this article, is up on the Point of View website, pointofview.net, a link to it. I really urge you to read it because, you know, it's it reads a lot like the stories we were talking about in the first hour. It was having college campuses. But the notion that young children, and you cite some examples in this article, very young children encouraged to begin to identify themselves and their classmates in terms of race as the primary identifying factor, that seems almost cruel to children.
Well, it absolutely is, and it runs completely counter to the American ideal of racial colorblindness. That is Dr. Martin Luther King's idea that people should be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. This new view takes exactly the opposite perspective. It's called critical race theory, and it's an extremist ideology that promotes race consciousness, which is the idea that your personal identity is tied to your skin color at the deepest possible level. And the corollary to that is that the problems that all minority groups experience are due to white privilege and white supremacy.
It's excruciating to even talk about this. I want to give our listeners some specifics. For example, in the Edina School District, their test scores are dropping. They talk about percent of students who meet state reading standards drop from 86 to 79. And this is actually a relatively recent thing. It's isn't the movement called All for One? I can't find the name in the article.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, we all know that correlation is not causation, that just because two things, declining test scores and the adoption of this new racial equity so-called plan, correspond in time doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. But, whoa, here it's a really troubling correlation because this new strategic plan adopted by school district leaders called the All for All plan in 2013 says that there will be a, quote, shift in the way that everything is done in the district, and I mean by bus drivers and cafeteria workers as well as teachers and the school superintendent. And it says that teachers must now view all, quote, teaching and learning through the lens of, quote, racial equity. So they mean this plan to be transformative in the way that instruction is delivered. And so when you see test scores, you know, declining as they have in the very same time period, you really need to look very closely at a link there.
You know, I want to go back to what this thing is really all about, this All for All program, because the shift in, you know, it's a funny thing. I think a lot of people in America would say, well, you know, we do need to be really sensitive and conscious of not to be insulting to others and to try to accept everyone and not judge people by the color of their skin. That was kind of the highest standard we used to talk about. You mentioned Martin Luther King's standard.
Right.
His own children judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And this is absolutely flipping that on its head. And this racial consciousness, folks, I cannot urge you strongly enough to go to, it's on my website too, americacomingtalk.org. It's on this pointofview.net website. But this study, this lengthy piece, it really goes through and develops the changes over a period of, I guess this is 4 years now, in the Edina School District, where every single policy is geared, and every topic they discuss and every person involved in interacting with children, all are encouraging them to be race conscious. And the consequence is the quality of education suffering, but you know, and even it's suffering for the minority students, right?
Yes. Oh my gosh. There's one particular elementary school. I should say that this All for All plan stated that from now on, that is, you know, back in 2013, there would be intentional hiring of, quote, race-conscious administrators and teachers. And that's happened in several elementary schools since that plan was adopted. So where a new principal came in 2016, now has kids, kindergarten through second grade, doing what's called the Melanin Project. And that's where these little children are told they need to trace their hands on paper, they need to color their hands, their skin color, and then they need to cut them out, and they're put on a poster in the classroom, and the poster says, stop thinking your skin color is better than anyone else's. As if these little 5-year-old kids are even thinking in those terms. And this year, the principal came up with something new. She said the greatest challenge in the school going forward is going to be to teach the kids about, quote, ancestry, genetic code, and melanin.
Oh.
I mean, what is going on here?
Well, I want to give a couple of examples to our readers, because our listeners, because these are so egregious. I just cannot imagine there isn't more uproar in the school district. But one example was they have an ABC book, like you used to get when you learned to read. Probably A is for apple, B is for ball, or whatever it was. They have A is for activist, C is for creative counter to corporate vultures, F is for feminist, T is for trans, X is for Malcolm, as in Malcolm X. And the reason I want to go down that path a minute with you, Kathy, is that this isn't just to raise sensitivity and be more, conscious of not judging others by their skin. This is a very left-wing agenda. I mean, even to characterize, C is for to counter corporate vultures. I mean, they're depicting businesses in America as vultures.
Right? Yeah, that's true. Now, let me just be clear. That book is recommended on the school's social media by the race-conscious principal. So she peddles that book to, or she endorses it for parents and students. That it is not used in the classroom, but she is telling parents and kids that this is a book that they need to get to basically raise their consciousness. You can see this is increasingly using public schools to indoctrinate students in a social political agenda and not to provide legitimate instruction in reading and writing and math.
And, I will say this is happening in Minnesota, Edina, Minnesota, which on the one hand, it was a very high quality public school district, and I would love for it to turn around. On
right at the top, yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, I will say Minnesota is a very left-wing state, goes Democrat in most things, and has the majority of the state is left-wing. And so even I was up there over the summer and held an event and had a bunch of people who were conservative come to the luncheon, and they were even there that people were saying, we kind of whisper when we meet in business meetings or lunchrooms. Whisper,
oh my gosh! Oh yeah.
I'm a conservative. Don't tell anybody. I'm a Republican. Don't tell anybody. I mean, so the notion this be happening there, but I have to believe, and we're going to go up to a break here in just 20 seconds. But and I want to talk when we come back about the reaction of the parents. Are they pushing back? And what could parents do? I mean, these are public schools. People probably, they went and bought homes, I'm assuming, in these neighborhoods with better quality schools, and this is what they're putting up with. I'm Debbie Georgatos.
You're exactly right.
Filling in a point of view, talking to Kathy Kersten. Don't go away.
Sometimes I joke that I'll win the lottery when God blows the winning ticket across a parking lot to me. I don't buy tickets, so if he wants me to win, that's the way. Pretty silly, right? But a lot of us take a similar stance when it comes to the ills of our culture. We don't do anything. We simply hope things will change. I encourage you to get in the game and make things change. Join Truth Team 360 and be part of a work that changes lives and communities. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151.
From Paramount Pictures and PureFlix comes Same Kind of Different as Me. Ron and Debbie Hall have everything they could ever want, except for a loving marriage. But when Debbie befriends a homeless man, their lives begin to intersect, and they are all changed forever.
Amazing how far a little tender love and care can go.
Same Kind of Different as Me, based on the true story. In theaters October 20th, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. More information is available at samekindofdifferentasmemovie.com.
Point of View will continue after this.
Just one. Okay.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. I'm Debbie Georgatos. So glad you've tuned in to Point of View. Sorry, I started to say my show, to Point of View. And again, we are speaking this evening with Kathy Kersten, who is with the in Minnesota, the Center of the American Experiment. Before I get into why the parents and kids are, or how they're responding and protesting, I want to be sure our listeners have a clear picture of the depth of the just invasion into the educational curricula at every level by this new program that was embraced in Edina, Minnesota in 2013. So you gave one example here. I just want to tell our listeners this. So in a high school required 10th grade English course called Pre-Advanced Placement English, for example, students read works that, quote, reflect diversity in race, gender, age, economics, and geography. The themes of the course are colonization, immigration, social constructions of race, class, and gender, and the humanity in the face of destruction. And the other quote was, by the end of the year, you will have learned how to apply Marxist, feminist, post-colonial, and psychoanalytical lenses to literature. I honestly, and one other thing I'll mention, just because your article is replete with just brilliant and specific examples of the way that education has been corrupted in Edina. But there's the endless thing of it is, I noticed, by the way, they took literature from the Southern Poverty Law Center, or as I always try to say, the thoroughly discredited Southern Poverty Law Center. But they talk about unpacking identity, unpacking diversity, understanding justice. And the themes that these kids are learning are all, it's not even really Democrat Party, it's radical leftism. Do you agree?
Yeah, and that's an elementary school. Another one that I enjoyed that was being used in this, K through 5 school, endorsed by the principal, is an essay called Raising Race-Conscious Children. I'm sorry, it's from that essay or from that internet site. And the essay is entitled, Are You a Boy or a Girl? Helping Young Children Think Through Gender. And the author describes herself as a, quote, white, cis, queer woman dedicated to collectively envisioning and implementing liberatory educational practices. This is for little kids.
She shouldn't be in a college campus teaching anything, let alone. I mean, it's truly flabbergasting. So you hear all this, and the truth is, the kids are the victims because they're going to finish 12th grade, and unless we change our entire curriculum of testing, they aren't going to know what they need to know. They're going to know a bunch of left-wing blather speak, which won't get them any place. But so aren't the parents, or are any parents up there in that area up in arms?
Well, there's another a side to this, and I should say a worse kind of side to this, which is the intimidation and bullying that go on toward kids with non-conforming views, let's say. Just some really horrific stories about how kids have been publicly shamed by teachers for taking a different point of view in class or writing an essay that takes a different point of view. So your question is, are parents pushing back? And, parents have tried to do that in an isolated fashion. Of course, they're always told the problem doesn't exist or they're the only ones complaining, et cetera. So this is very deeply entrenched. And I think what parents can do is to organize, to refuse to be intimidated. Parents are concerned about retaliation against their kids and, poor grades and that kind of thing. But they have to stand up to this. They have to provide the evidence and, pull your kids. If you can't pull them out of the school, pull them out of particular classes or say that they're not going to read book X and that the school is obligated to find another book for them to read. But so far, parents have just been, I think, so intimidated by the rough handling and the bullying of themselves and their kids that they just haven't been effective.
That's simply mind-blowing. Kathy, we've had a caller who's been trying to come on, and I think he does have a question. We're going to try for Rich. Rich, you're so kind to hold on. We'll see if we can get you. It's Rich in Texas.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for taking my call.
Well, thank you for hanging on long enough. This was a struggle learning the system. Hello, sir.
Great information, interesting concepts. I work in a public high school and have for over 20 years, and I would be that person a parent would call. The point of my call is to say that it's primarily, this is an adult problem. In the high schools in America, we don't have race tensions. The kids go home, they scroll on Twitter, they watch the news, and it's an adult problem. We don't have less an isolated incident, these racial tensions or these extreme views in a large majority of our schools.
Rich, I think that's a great point. Kathy, I'd love to hear your thought on that. I mean, I do feel like the emphasis on race, it presents the issue as a far more egregious racial tension in America than really exists. You think that's fair, Kathy?
Well, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, they're trying to stoke it. Little 5-year-olds don't automatically think of themselves and their next-door neighbors in terms of the color of their skin. What this is doing with kindergarten is actually putting in their heads the very ideas that these people claim to be rejecting. So that's certainly an initial problem. But I think that furthermore, that this is part of a larger agenda. Race is only part of this, but there's the class and the gender portions of the agenda as well. And it seems to me that more and more, as the racial prejudice of the past evaporates, as Jim Crow laws are 60 years out of date now. I think some of the people with a real interest in the kind of power that political attention can give are focusing more and more on, say, microaggressions. They can't point to segregated water fountains. So more and more they're pointing to these invisible acts of racial aggression that nobody sees and they claim are really happening, and sensitizing kids to think of themselves as victims just reflexively. And this is a terrible problem.
I think that's exactly right. And, there was an article recently which Heather McDonald addressed the research relating to implicit bias. It's the next argument that the left has about racism is, even though it's not, as you say, separate water fountains, it's not separate education, they're more microaggressions. And even the studies now, they're trying to argue that even though you don't think you're racist, we can study your thinking and tell you still are, even though you think you're not. Have you come across that?
Oh my gosh, that's absolutely the case, and that is what this all-for-all plan is about. The notion of institutional embedded racism that white people aren't even aware of. They have to feel, to be burdened by guilt for these invisible attitudes they're told that they hold. And again, I think it's all about power for the people who are selling this to public school officials.
Absolutely it is. I'll hit one other point. And first of all, Rich, thank you for holding out. It was great to get to have you on the air. Kathy, I want to hit one other point you hit in your article I think is really worthy of talking about. And that is the whole notion that that this all-in-all program that has been embraced in Edina, Minnesota, is based on, there's one fundamental premise that white racism and not socioeconomic factors like family breakdown is the primary cause of the achievement gap. If minority students' academic performance is to improve, and it goes on and on about how the systems that perpetuate inequities must be interrupted. So it's blaming poor academic performance among some minority groups on white racism. And, you know, I will tell you, it is so crazy. You can quickly address that if you wouldn't, any thoughts you want to share about that?
Yes, well, that's exactly right. I mean, and it conditions kids, minority kids and white kids, to think of minority children as victims, as permanent victims who are not responsible for their own well-being, their own academic performance at all. I mean, all of us are prone to that, right? It's so tempting to view others as causing your problems. But what an attitude to saddle these young minority children with for life. I mean, it's just guaranteed to prevent maturity, to prevent productive adulthood if you're always looking for somebody else to blame for the challenges that you face.
Exactly right. And I want to share, I will after our break with our listeners, I'm going to share, I went to a summit in Washington, D.C. recently with Star Parker, who founded the CURE organization, and she is trying to tackle inner city poverty from an entirely different perspective of basically stop blaming everybody else, focus on these issues. I'll share that. But Kathy, I want to give you a chance to share with our listeners. Your organization is just, maybe I'm a tiny bit wonky, but I love your organization. I love the research you do.
Thank you.
So would you share with our listeners all about which your organization is, the Center for American American Experience, what you do and how people can find it?
Sure, absolutely. Okay, well, let me say, first of all, that the article I wrote about this, the long one, is it's a long article, and some people won't have time to read it. Therefore, I would suggest people who just have 2 minutes to look at this, go to the short version of this article, which appeared on the website of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune newspaper. I don't know if you have that link, Debbie, but it'd be great to get that up there for people if they don't have it. So the Center for the American Experiment is a public policy institution. We are interested in a whole range of issues, economics, energy, education, et cetera, and we are Minnesota's think tank. We're at www.americanexperiment.org.
Kathy Kersten, thank you so much.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The United States military probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of the Jewish High Holy Days. Yet thanks to our country's dedication to religious liberty, our military has often shown its respect for the faith of its service members. Back in 1898, during the Spanish-American War, about 5,000 Jews served in our country's military. 4,000 of them put in for furloughs in order to attend services for the Jewish high holidays. By 1944, the Nazis had exterminated almost every Jew in the French village of Verdun. A year later, 500 Jewish American GIs would gather in Verdun's town square to observe Rosh Hashanah. That same September, on the other side of the globe, B-29 crews occupied the island of Guam. For many of them, it would be their last Rosh Hashanah. The hangar was converted to a Jewish house of worship under the direction of the commanding general for that station, himself not Jewish. Still, men of all faiths built seats, a pulpit, the Holy Ark for Scriptures, erected lighting, and even a sound system. 1,500 men would pray for, quote, peace to him who is far off and to him that is near. These are just a handful of ways in which the United States military, even during times of war, acknowledged the essence of the First Amendment, that men have a great duty to the Creator, that government must respect. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
You can learn how to protect religious freedom in the workplace, public schools, your church, the military, and more by downloading First Liberty's free Religious Liberty Protection Kits at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org. If you want hope for religious freedom, go to firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. And again, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm Debbie Georgatos, sitting in on Point of View for Kirby Anderson and Rich, who was our very patient caller. I'm so glad we got you on. And if you're still listening, I think we hit a wrong button, and so you're welcome to call back again. Okay, I must tell you, Point of View has these fabulous, beautiful, wonderful this new studio. I guess it isn't that new anymore, but it's just very, it's a lovely, great studio. It's great to be. I enjoy being here every time I'm here, whether I'm on the round table or substitute hosting. And so I've pretty much mastered everything except the button pushing. So if you, Rich, if you're still listening, you're welcome to call back, and thank you for your call earlier. And also I want to tell our listeners that we got kind of rushed at the end of that last segment. But the Center of the American Experiment in Minnesota, they just are full of brilliant thinkers. And here's Rich coming back in just 1 second. They are filled with brilliant thinkers on serious substantive policy. And the other thing I want to say about them is what they're saying is very brave. We didn't get to talking about this with Katherine Kersten, but when she tried to point out what is happening in Edina, Minnesota, and how, I mean, there are examples. Her article is lengthy, and I'll put up on Point of View, make sure it's up, the more summarized version that appeared in the newspaper up there, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, I think it's called. I have it right in front of me. I'll make sure the link goes up on pointofview.net. But, you know, they were basically saying all this emphasis on race and race consciousness and white supremacism and white racism and all this stuff, it's really stifling the learning environment. It is creating more tension. It is not solving it. And it is, but what the school district has done, they have hired so many administrators and teachers living and just marinating all day long in this left-wing ideology of race consciousness and just the left-wing agenda right down the path, including socialism. Just everything about it is so radically anti-American. And it's very brave for Katherine Kersten to write this article. She got a lot of pushback. She got, in fact, the Center of the American Experiment tried to communicate with the Edina parents to let them know that they were trying to cover this story and were trying to expose this. And they got criticized very openly and publicly in Minneapolis media. They had they had parents and students calling them, telling the Center of the American Experiment, tell Kathy and others at Center of the American Experiment what's happening in Edina, how bad it is, how frustrating it is, and they'd run the stories, but not one single person they talked to was willing to have their name in the article because the environment in the Edina public school system, I mean, there is no other word, it's fascist. It's absolutely intolerant of anyone who will not agree with the left-wing view. And so Center of the American Experiment is kind of bravely stepping out there saying, something's got to be done about this, because it's not just these kids are going to try to be Democrat voters. It's because they're not learning the substance of the materials they're supposed to be learning. Their averages are falling, their test scores are falling, and the substance of what they're learning is so radically anti-American and divisive and pitting Americans against each other. It's just the worst possible agenda. So they've been brave, a lot of to speak up. She's gotten a lot of criticism, and she marches on. So I really urge you to go to pointofview.net. And now I'm going to go back to our friend Rich, who was so kind to call back again. And hi, Rich.
Yes, good afternoon. I just wanted to close with a thought that, yes, things happen in public schools, and this school in Minnesota does not reflect the entire country. I work in a public school and have for decades, and don't see anything on the horizon of anything being described in Minnesota.
Okay, so are you in Texas?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so the great state of Texas, I will say, wherever you're listening from, Texas is kind of in fact, on many political things I'm involved in, Texas is often referred to as kind of the, ground zero for conservatism in America. We are the place where we're holding on to liberty and holding on to the notion that America was not founded on random concepts, but actually on important developed through the centuries, millennia ideas about freedom and liberty and the rights of man. This is on the American ideals that created our country, and Texas is hang on to those. I don't think Edina is a great example to be contrasting with Texas, because Edina in Minnesota itself is just filled with left-wing thinkers, and so they have made great progress here. But I agree, plenty of school districts aren't like this, and I do think to fight it. I mean, I'll ask you, what do you think if you were a teacher in Edina? What would you do?
Well, there's teachers like perhaps you and I in that school district and in those schools, and they do keep quiet. but there are right-leaning teachers and administrators throughout the country. And to highlight on a national show that perhaps it's like this in more than one location, I just think a perspective was in order.
Well, I'm glad you shared it. And Rich, I am glad you called back again. That was we'll be better at this tomorrow. I'm doing the show again tomorrow. I'll be better at this tomorrow. So, Rich, thank you so much for your call. I appreciate it very much. And, folks, I'll just say this about, I agree. Rich is right that not every school district is like this. And in fact, the vast majority are not. But these should be warning signals to people when you see things happening in your school, because the left wing in America figured out decades ago that the way to shift American culture to the left, to more of a willingness to be open to the idea of socialism, to surrendering your liberty, to being to agreeing that government should control a lot of society, was to create division. In fact, is why there's so much division. The left formulates many of their political campaigns around identity politics. It is an absolute deliberate attempt to divide America and have people begin to identify themselves as victims, located and plopped into victim classes, and that they are pitted against other groups of Americans, and that they need the left-wing government to make things fair, because the left works very hard to make sure people are suspicious of their neighbors. And so these young, as Kathy Kersten was describing, kindergartners being taught, they're being scolded at kindergarten level to stop thinking you're so important just because of your skin color, when the kids aren't thinking anything like that. They're thinking, what time is recess and do we get to have a snack today? That's what they're thinking. But instead they have to deal with this just very heavy left-wing bullying, and it's good to be alert to it. So that's going to close in one other, the 2 hours always race by here. They race by my show too, but I want to close with a story that I think is, I'm not sure if Kirby has or others on the show have covered this story, but I'm not going to go into any detail except to say many people in this country are aware of the stories surrounding Harvey Weinstein, the Hollywood producer, and now just literally, the stories coming out, decades of sexual harassment and accusations of rape against many, many women, decades and dozens and dozens. In fact, the number is, I think, up to 36 women who've specifically come forward and said their names and say, I was harassed by him too. And the reason I want to mention this on this show is that, there's a tendency in secular culture to mock traditional Christian values. For example, even when Vice President Pence said that he has a standing rule, he doesn't go to dinner with a woman unless his wife is there. And I mean, there was so much mockery of that, and just, how provincial and outdated and old fashioned and, sexist, all the words the left comes up with, just mocking him, and misogynist, I think, was a big one on that story. Just all these words trying to claim that there was something wrong with him for having that idea that he didn't want to be out at dinner with a woman unless his wife was there. And, I will say, at the time I defended what he had to say, and I still do now, but I think the Weinstein story is it's a good example of, when you have the left through media and movies and Hollywood and music and cultural conversation, urging sexual promiscuity, mocking of traditional Christian values related to marriage and related to, intimacy, belonging in marriage. You have that. You do have a culture that emerges that is just flounders around to look for a set of values. And so many women who were victims of Weinstein didn't like it very much. Weinstein didn't like it very much, and they're complaining now, but they put up with it for decades. And I do think it was an encouragement to Christians around the country to be comfortable asserting your morality and the importance of it in America, because we really, it is the best protection for women and men to have that kind of morality as the norm. Okay, I can't believe they're playing music. I'm trying to talk. 2 hours are up. Thank you so much for tuning in to Point of View. Go to pointofview.net for the articles. Debbie Georgatos, talk to you tomorrow.
From director Kevin Sorbo and executive producer Sean Hannity comes Let There Be Light. Saul Harkins is a man who has turned away from God, but a near-fatal car crash gives him one last chance to renew his life, his family, and his faith. Let There Be Light, rated PG-13. May be inappropriate for children under 13. In theaters October 27. More information is available at LetThereBeLightMovie.com.
Christianity is based in history, on evidence, and all truth revealed in God's Word is for our good, not just spiritually, but in every way. Point of View's mission is to restore God's truth in our culture, and to do it effectively, we need you as a partner. Your gift helps inspire people, young and old, from coast to coast to rebuild truth in their communities. Join the Truth Team today at pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Get off the sidelines. Pointofview.net/team. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.